welcome to Chapter 7, Art Appreciation. This is our chapter on painting. We're going to cover several types of painting based on this medium topic. You can see a list on your screen of some of the different ones we're going to go through, maybe some that are familiar to you and some you've maybe never heard of. So hopefully you'll get the full spectrum and some examples of each one of those. So the list there includes encaustic, fresco, tempera, oil, watercolor-based media, acrylic, collage, mosaic, and tapestry. So we will jump right in. What is painting? You may be asking yourself, or maybe you're not. But basically, if you think about it, paint is an important thing in our modern world. It's everywhere. We paint our houses, we paint porches, artwork is paint. There's just lots and lots of paint everywhere. We use it for fun and we use it for practical purposes as well. Creative things. It preserves things. If your fence is outside, you need to put a coat of paint on it so it doesn't weather. Things like that. But basically all paint, whether industrial or artistic purpose, consists of some form of the following things. So you can see that little equation at the top of your screen, and the red box that says paint is some different types. There's oil paint, tempera, pastel, watercolor, acrylic paint, alkyd paint, casein paint, and other kinds as well. Then there is an equal sign, because these things to the right of paint are things that are combined together. Some paint products will have more or less, some won't have them at all, a few of these things at all, but there's some combination of these things in most paints. You have a pigment, which we have talked about before. Pigment can be inorganic, it can also be organic. Inorganic would be things that are synthetically made, where organic is the traditional, as we saw clear back to the cave paintings. People found ways to use materials, organic compounds, minerals, plant matter, to grind it up into a powder and mix it with something to create color. That's really the essence of pigment, is to be able to create color. So the pigment is in everything that's paint that has color. And then you need to have a binder, which is the green box. Binders include things like oils, proteins, waxes, carbohydrates, gums, resins, polymers. As you may glance down on the bottom of the screen, I'm going to read these definitions again, but a binder is basically making sure that the paint will adhere to a surface. So it's the thing that holds it on to what you're painting it on. Fillers and additives is the gray box, which is kind of what it sounds like. Fillers. It makes the pigment go further by adding some filler. Chalk, gypsum, kaolin, BaSO4, includes dryers and stabilizers also, it says. Those are things that make your paint do what you want it to do. I don't know, nail polish. There's fast drying nail polish. Well, that's going to have some special filler or additive, an additive in that case, to make it dry faster, or spray paint that dries faster. They have to have chemicals put into those that will do what we want it to do. And then the last thing is a diluent, which would be something that thins the paint down. And you can't just pour water into any kind of paint to thin it down, can you? You all probably know from life that oil paint isn't going to thin down with water mixed in. That's disastrous. It's going to cause your paint to fail for sure. Some require turpentine, some require mineral spirits, water, acetone. Those are the things that will thin it down, spread it out, that it can be removed with, in fact, in a lot of those cases. Something that will dissolve that paint so that you can get it off of something. Okay, and then just looking through these terminology here, just to make sure you have these in your notes. You don't have to necessarily know all of those things that were in that little equation I just went through, but these with the blue writing you'll want to make sure you know. So what is pigment again? It's a powdered color made from organic or synthetic, or another way you could say that is inorganic material, like we've talked about multiple times, plus the vehicle or medium. So what is the definition of that? Liquid that holds the pigments together without dissolving them. So like oil is an example of that. But also think of it's the thing that makes it move. So that kind of helps you when you think about vehicle. It holds the pigment together, but it's making it move like a vehicle makes you move. That's the way to memorize it. I put an asterisk by medium because media and medium is kind of a funny word in art that we use in multiple ways. So down at the bottom where it says note, media and medium are also used to refer to all materials used in a work of art. Oftentimes we'll talk about what medium did you use. So it's kind of a word that has two definitions basically in the art world. So again, that's a liquid that holds it together, but also it makes it movable. It makes it flowable, right? It makes it so that it isn't just a thick chunk of pigment, but you can actually spread it out. You can drive it around like a vehicle. And then we have plus the binders. And the binders are in the medium. It's something that's part of it, and it's an ingredient that ensures the paint will adhere to the surface. So all of those things you got to have. Different ways, different forms. We'll talk about lots of different types of painting today. One other thing we need to make sure you understand is when you paint, you have to have a support. What do you paint on? A support is anything, that's just the art word, that is anything on which the artist works. Things like a canvas, paper, wood, clay, stone, really anything. A lot of artists do some cool stuff with using unusual surfaces to paint on. Bark from a tree, or an old cardboard box. There's just, whatever the message of the art is, that can become part of the artwork, is the material, the support that the artist is painting on. So there's a wide variety of things. Really anything goes for a support. The more traditional ones, of course, are like a canvas or fine paper, which works well for painting on. A lot of artists use like 1/8 of an inch plywood board cut into pieces and then primed, so you can just paint on wood. It's a little cheaper way to do like easel paintings. We've talked about, again, the cave paintings. They painted on the cave walls, right? That was their support. Stone, again. So there's just lots of different things. One thing that does matter, though, you could think about train cars or graffiti painted on the side of buildings, or murals and wall art. All of those things could be very large supports where painting can happen. But if you don't have the next thing, a ground or primer, you may have problems with the archival quality of your painting. What does that mean? It means how long is it going to last on the surface that you've painted it on. Just like when you are painting a house, painting a room inside of a house, you need to have the right kind of wall surface. I don't know if you've ever seen a house built new or been in one where they have just put up the drywall and they do all the sanding and get the seams all finished and nice. Then it's time to paint it, right? But it's very important that you prime the walls first, because if you don't, the paint will just soak into that drywall and you're going to waste gallons of paint just soaking into the drywall and not staying on the surface. So you need a primer or a ground to make that surface appropriate for the type of paint that you're going to use. And all painting is that way. If you're doing an oil painting on a canvas, you need to have the canvas primed with the right type of ground or primer that will keep the oil paint from soaking in to the canvas. Because we want the paint to stay on the surface and we want to adhere to it good so that it stays long term. And I don't know if you've ever bought something at Lowe's or Home Depot and tried to do a home project like painting a porch or, like I said, a fence or something, and you've gotten the wrong kind of product and it doesn't adhere properly and it fails within a few years. Or in my case, I did a back porch with a paint that this winter snow has completely made it fail. It's like peeling off the porch. So it's very important that you know what kind of surface you have in real life and everyday life, painting something, but also in artwork. So the first type of painting we're going to look at is called encaustic. This one may be one you're not as familiar with. It comes from the Greek word meaning burning in. And listen to what it consists of. It's made of pigment mixed with wax and resin. As the colors are heated, the wax melts and can be easily brushed onto a support where it hardens as it cools. It's an ancient method that's still used today. What do you think the advantage of using an encaustic would be? Think about that for a second. We're talking about wax and resin. Resin, as it cures, is going to be like a hard, very durable surface, and wax also dries very firm and durable. If you can picture it, and I know that picture shows you a little bit, the artist is dripping wax onto her surface, her ground. The color, the pigment, is part of it. It's like you're using this hot wax and putting the pigment into that. And so when it dries, hardens, cures, the paint is part of the surface. It's not just on top of the surface like I was describing before. In this technique, it is part of the surface. It is a process, I can tell you, that takes a lot of skill because it doesn't have, it's not like you can rework it very much. You almost just have to keep layering it on top of itself. And it is a very ancient method, which I can show you with the next slide. This one is titled Young Woman with a Gold Pectoral, which is 100 to 150 CE. So this is just 100 years into the Common Era. And these oftentimes would be used on like burial tombs. They would oftentimes in ancient cultures or very old cultures, like Egyptian, Byzantine, I believe would be a Byzantine image. They would paint the image using the encaustic method on the coffin so you could see what the person looked like. It was kind of a way, like a portrait, to honor this person once they're dead. You know, a lot of times at funerals now, we put a photograph of the person up, almost like a little memorial thing when you go into a service. That's just a very common thing now, to remember what they look like, to a good picture of them, usually, right? We don't usually put a bad picture of them up. And we kind of use it as a way to remember and honor them. And that's really what they were doing with these coffin images. But the thing is, these were very, very durable. So do you see how that would be a useful thing in some sort of a tomb or coffin where a person was laid to rest? And this one, if you take a look at it, after having described the technique to you where you apply hot wax and resin and the pigments mixed into it, the level of skill is tremendous in this because it's a very difficult way to paint. And so as you can see, this is look at the mouth and the nose and what detail and three-dimensional effect this artist was able to create in 100 CE. Kind of in contrast to that, we have Jasper Johns' Numbers in Color from 1958 on the right side, and this is also encaustic, a very much more updated, modern, contemporary picture, and it is also recognizable. So he was using, it looks like stencils in some way to create these numbers, but it also has that layering wax pigment effect. So they were just very hard, very durable. And it, artists do it for whatever reason now. It's more of an interest thing and a kind of like liking the effect that you get when you paint with the encaustic. Not very popular, I would say. Not as near as many people use encaustic technique as others. The next technique, fresco, is kind of similar and also not a super frequently used painting technique currently. It is used today, but it's definitely more of an ancient method. So the definition there, for fresco is a technique where it mixes pigments with water and is applied to a plaster support. So that picture's pretty good there to show you how you work with fresco. It is both those techniques, encaustic and fresco, are very time consuming and, like I said, a high level of skill. I don't think an inexperienced person can just jump in and start doing this for it to work very well. You have to understand plaster, first of all. So you see the trowel there with a chunk of wet plaster on it, and he's spreading out the plaster onto the wall. And then you see a drawn image of a person, and it looks like it's done with perhaps Conte crayon, like we talked about in the drawing chapter. And so what they oftentimes will do, like that whole area is probably wet. You can only work small areas at a time. So maybe like a 2 by 2 foot area. You apply the plaster like he's doing. You sketch the picture on very lightly, like with a crayon like he did, or some people even just use dots. They like actually poke little holes into the plaster where they're to draw it with a poking technique rather than drawing with a Conte crayon or something. And then they paint into the fresco. So there's a couple ways to do fresco, and take a look down at the bottom in blue. It says fresco secco is Italian for dry fresco or working on a dry plaster surface. So in this technique, it's not what I just said where you work in a wet plaster. It's you would apply the plaster and then go back and paint the paint on top of that. So it's still painting on plaster, but it's not going to soak into the plaster quite as much as buon fresco, which means true fresco. That is where you are applying the pigment and water into wet lime plaster surface. So this person, as you're seeing in the picture there, apply the plaster wet, draw your image on, and while it's still wet, you mix up pigment and water, and when you paint onto the plaster, it soaks into the plaster, which means that the painting is the wall, if you can think of it that way. As I just described, when we do a mural or something, we paint on top of a wall, but this is in the surface of the wall, which makes very difficult repair work if you have to repair a fresco, because it's actually going to have chunks of the wall flaking off, and that has to be repaired very carefully. And the last little definition there is cartoon. Not a funny cartoon Tom and Jerry, but that actually means a full-size drawing of the entire project. So what you're seeing there would be like the cartoon of what this person is creating. So let me show you an image from the Renaissance. This is titled The School of Athens. It's a painting by Raphael, not the Ninja Turtle, but the artist, 1510 to 11. So this is right at the peak of the Renaissance time in Italy. And frescoes were very popular and done frequently at this time period. That was one of the main ways of painting for Renaissance painters. So this is actually on the wall. And get a second to look at this thing because you've got a lot going on. It's almost like we're looking into a space, but it's painted on a wall in a space. So just seeing it like this is a little hard to understand what you're looking at. But all that architecture you're seeing is the painting. Use my cursor. This is the painting. This is not part of the building. It's a painting of a building. And so we look into this scene and we see Socrates and Plato here at the center, which were ancient Greek philosophers. And so just a little bit of background on the Renaissance. The Renaissance in Italy, the Italian Renaissance, was a rebirth of, which we'll talk about this later, rebirth of ancient Greek art, thinking, philosophy, not just art, but all things. Just exploring what is capable of the human mind and talent and abilities. And so what this whole entire scene sort of does is smush together these ancient Greek philosophers who at this time would have been hundreds of years before Raphael was painting this. But then he also throws in modern day philosophers, artists. You can see here, this kind of larger guy here in the front is actually Michelangelo. He's painted into this scene. I was going to point out where Raphael is because he did paint himself into the scene. I think this is him here. We have another philosopher here holding the globe, as you can see, talking about, oh no, I'm sorry. This was right here. I believe this guy is Raphael. He's looking at us. Do you see that? That's kind of a mysterious little thing he put into it. That's him peeking around the corner and looking at us. So it's got lots of meaning in it, lots of reference to Greek sculpture back here, antiquity, the height of Greek culture, but it's kind of saying like we now in the Italian Renaissance, the rebirth time of all these wonderful things that a human can do, it's a celebration of that, and we're all together, past and current. And then we have, and then I wanted to note what this slide says. Frescoes of the Italian Renaissance are considered greatest of all Western art. Pope Julius II asked Michelangelo to work on the Sistine Chapel ceiling, which is a really famous work of art that's just kind of like an iconic thing of the Renaissance. And at the same time, Raphael was asked to decorate the walls of the Vatican Palace. So these artists, Raphael, Michelangelo, yes, the other ones too, Donatello, Leonardo da Vinci, they were all painting around the same time period, give or take. Some of them were a little older than others, but 14 through 1600s, this was all going on. And it is good to put in your head now, the church was the main, the church was a large supporter of the arts, and where many people could find work. The best of the best, I should say. These famous masters could find work that way. They didn't always like what they had to do, but they were commissioned by the Pope, and so they would do these projects that they didn't necessarily like to do. For instance, Michelangelo didn't actually want to paint the Sistine Chapel ceiling, but he felt a lot of pressure to do so by the Pope. So, and we'll talk about the Sistine Chapel ceiling later. Okay, so that is a nice example of a fresco. The Last Supper that we looked at by Da Vinci, very well-known, famous painting, is also a fresco, and that's why that woman is painstakingly restoring it in the previous slides that I showed you. The next type of paint is tempera. The tempera technique uses an emulsion as a vehicle. Remember, the vehicle is a thing that makes it go, right? Makes it into a liquid. And this emulsion, which let me just tell you what an emulsion is. It's when you have two liquids mixed together that don't necessarily completely physically bind together. They have a little bit of, one stays like droplets within the other. And so a common example of tempera emulsion is egg yolk and milk. So again, an emulsion is a mixture of an aqueous liquid like water or milk and mixed with something like oil, fat, wax, or resin. Those things do not completely dissolve and completely become a homogeneous mixture with the aqueous liquid mixture. So it's a mixture, and it'll look like it's mixed up, and it becomes something together, but it never fully chemically makes a different mixture and bonds together. It's like little droplets within the other. So you see in that picture, there's an actual cracked egg there, and that's because in the guy's jar there, he has egg mixed with milk. That's your emulsion. And then he has it in this little bowl to be smushed with this, I forgot what those are called, like a pharmacist's tool to blend the mixtures together. And then here's the pigment that he's poured into that. So he's going to mix all this together, and then he can paint with his paintbrush onto the ground that he's the paper here. Tempera is a very old technique. It's a very simple one and something that you can make with home ingredients. Obviously, the egg yolk and the milk is how you make the emulsion, and then you can mix it with just a home thing like paprika would be a spice that has a lot of colorant to it. You could use that. You could use cinnamon or other spices that look like they have some rich color to them. Mix them with that emulsion, and you'll get paint that you can paint with. This particular example by Jacob Lawrence is purposefully done in this style. So don't think that, oh, it looks kind of cartoonish and not very realistic. That was his intent. He wanted to make it look this way. And but he was using tempera as his paint medium. And I actually wanted to read you a little bit about the meaning behind this one, because I know that sometimes when you see a work of art that looks maybe cartoonish or simplified, sometimes it's hard to know what the artist was trying to say with that without reading a little bit about their history and what they were wanting to say with their art. So Jacob Lawrence, he used tempera to make a series of images that tell a story. In this case, the story of the Great Migration, the migration of thousands of African Americans from the South to the North, beginning about 1910. Lawrence has said that he was drawn to the raw, sharp, rough effect of tempera colors, qualities he brings out quite well in his scrappy handling here. The paint applied sparingly to simplified forms. And he's part of a movement or an art time period that we like to categorize so we can kind of put things together in our minds of a timeline a bit, known as the Harlem Renaissance. So like Harlem we sometimes associate with hardship or poverty as a region, but and yes, it is true of that, but during the 1920s it experienced a tremendous cultural upsurge, and it's come to be known as the Harlem Renaissance, which is kind of cool because I just talked about the Italian Renaissance. A Renaissance in the art world is a rebirth of something where an explosion of cultural, intellectual, just an expression of people's minds and abilities and creativity, both musically, artistically, visually, and in literary terms as well. So this is an example, one piece of artwork from that time period. They're musicians, writers, artists, poets, scientists, and they just a huge upspring lived or worked in Harlem at this time in the 1920s. He kind of caught the tail end of the Harlem Renaissance. Lawrence moved to Harlem from Philadelphia with his mother, and he just jumped right into loving art and went to art school for a while. And really the subject matter just from his own life experience, his own experience living as an African American. The hardship of poor people in the ghettos, the violence that greeted blacks moving from the South to the urban North, and the upheaval of the civil rights movement during the 1960s. Nearly always his art has a narrative content or story. So just a little bit of background on that particular work of art. I would like to show you another example of tempera to show you the variety of that, but I don't think I have. I might insert that in just a second. So the next type of paint we're going to talk about is oil painting. Oil paints consist of pigment mixed typically with, guess what, oil. Kind of gives it away for that one. Notice there's always a pigment mixed with something, right? So we have a binder that also is oftentimes part of the vehicle. And in this case, it's linseed oil. So if you know anything about oil or varnish, you know that it cures. It takes time to dry. And what basically happens is it's clear and the pigment in the oil dissolves and becomes part of the oil. And then as it dries slowly, you basically have this transparent film, hard surface that holds the pigment within it. So the pigment, as it says there, is suspended in the oil. There's a lot of good things that artists like about oil painting. One of them is that you can paint with a glaze. Glazes are thin layers of translucent, meaning you can see through them in some way. Pretty clear, with a little bit of color added, applied over opaque paint. So you can paint layers that are opaque, meaning you can't see through them. They're just like real solid. But then you can put layers of translucent color on top of that. So you get a very beautiful layering effect where you see one color through another, and it just does infinite things with color mixing and what you can do with the color. You can create a very interesting effect of layering. Okay, alla prima is another type, and that means fast painting that's done all at once. That's not necessarily only an oil painting term, I don't think, but oil painting is one that usually does take time, and people like to spend a lot of time on it. But when you do it alla prima, you just go fast and you get the whole thing done at once. Because it dries so slowly, you can work on it one day and come back the next day, and it will still be wet in a lot of places, and you can rework areas. And then impasto is an Italian word meaning paste, and that is like a thick and highly textured application of paint. So just to trigger your mind back to something you might have remembered from previous lectures, is Vincent van Gogh. He was using oil paint. This was the type he was using, and he would paint it so very thick that you could just see it sticking off the canvas. He oftentimes would use a palette knife to smear it on rather than blending it out with a brush. And even to this day, they say some of his paintings are so thick that it's probably got wet paint inside of it because it's just painted so thick. Not like drippy wet, but just paint that is still active, because oil paint just dries so slowly, and if you have it really, really thick, it doesn't ever fully dry out deep within that. Or it can still stay oily and not totally dry. So impasto is thick, paste-like, and very textury. And for the example I'm going to show you is not impasto. This is a painting by Petrus Christus, a goldsmith in his shop. This would be from the Northern Renaissance. We talk about lots of Renaissances. And while the one was happening in Italy, there was a Renaissance going on in the north. And it was really a rebirth there as well of just booming time of art, culture, poetry, literature, music. However, the style is quite different than what was happening in Italy. Another one, you may think, I hope this triggers your brain and you remember another painting you've seen that's similar in style to this one, is the Arnolfini double wedding portrait that we looked at way back when we were talking about symbolism and iconic things. So this one also would be an example of symbolism, like the weights in his hands. I won't go into all that this time, but this is symbolic of something. The mirror is symbolic of something. The red belt laying here is symbolic. All these objects would actually recommend or refer to something else. They have meaning to them. But this is showing you an example for the purpose not of meaning, iconography, but of technique and paint type. And what we have here is an oil painting where look at the subtle changes in the cheeks of the people. Look at how it just very subtly goes from shadow to highlight. That's a thing that oil painting can really allow you to do, because you can just very slowly and carefully blend, blend, blend and get nice subtle changes. Look at her dress, the very iridescent looking, almost metallic look of that. That can be accomplished too. And the red garment of Pietis Christus, where they almost look shiny and iridescent. That's that effect of the layering of glaze, where you take this clear glaze, a very translucent paint, and you paint on top of what was already there, and it just makes it look very shiny and three-dimensional and just very beautiful when you use those layering glazing techniques. So, looking at this list, some of the advantages of oil painting are that it does dry slowly. It allows you to work slowly, blending, mixing, taking your time, really. Subtle blending of color. So it just very subtle. It's not as sharp and drastic as some of the other painting mediums can be. This allows for very subtle blending of color. Can be reworked. Layers can be applied, like I mentioned with the glazes. And a variety of consistencies. You can paint from these thin glazes of varnish, basically, with a little bit of pigment mixed in. That's just like a clear glaze, like when you're polyurethaning a table. It almost feels like that thin and just like this kind of nice honey spreading stuff, and with pigment in it. That type of painting, all the way to impasto, where it's just like thick, like a paste that you're smearing on the canvas. You can have lots of different consistencies. And what makes the consistency different is how much thinner you're putting into it. So do you remember I said not all paints can use water to thin them down? This is one you cannot use water to thin it down. You'd have to use like turpentine, mineral spirits, or you could use a little more oil, a little more of the vehicle, the linseed oil, to thin it down and make it more spreadable and more glaze-like. So there's ways to make it thick or thin. So that's oil paint. Our next one is watercolor-based media. And watercolor is, just like all things, pigment, the pigment powder, in a vehicle, and the vehicle with watercolor is going to be water and gum arabic. So really the gum arabic is the binder. That's the thing that holds the paint together. And it's made from tree sap. And its main characteristic is transparency. So when you paint with watercolor, it's really a whole different type of painting. It's not putting down a thick opaque color. It's always about layering and using the transparency and the see-throughness of the watercolor to your benefit. Watercolors look different. They feel different when you paint with them. And I chose that picture there with the paintbrush in it to show you just how watery they are. They're not going to be like a thick impasto paint ever. It's very watery. Now you can have more pigment in it. The more pigment you add, the deeper the color is going to be, the less transparent. The more water you add, water's clear, right? So the more water you add, the more transparent or see-through the paint's going to be. And so it's just really a matter of controlling how much water you're putting into the paint that you're painting with. That picture right there is pretty watery. So when he paints that blue, it's going to be pretty see-through and it's going to look fairly light blue. If he wants it to be darker blue, then he needs to get some more of this blue paint and mix it into that and get it a little more opaque. Opaque is not see-through, transparent is see-through. And here's a picture of all the different types of watercolor that there are. You can get watercolor in tubes like this, where it's just the thick, it's kept liquid, and you just squirt it out. It's like the pigment and gum arabic together. the pigment and the binder together, and then you add water to it still to get this kind of watery effect. You never just paint straight with this. If you can see where I'm holding my cursor here, that squirted out watercolor paint would be extremely dark if you just painted straight with that. You have to add water to it to make it flow and move and be seen. And then you can see these are cakes, watercolor cakes, where you just, like you've probably played with in elementary school, where it's a hard cake of watercolor, like Crayola watercolors are the same idea. You get your paintbrush wet and you brush into the paint cake, and that works up the pigment in the gum arabic to where it's into a watery substance that you can then paint with. These are palettes where you mix watercolor to mix and blend your colors. Here's a palette here too as well. Watercolor brushes, as a side note, have to be softer. They have to have, you don't want to use like a coarse bristled brush, or it's not going to really help your watercolor to spread out and flow on your paper. It's going to scratch it and not blend it or brush it very well. You really do have to use softer bristles on your brushes. And here's our example of watercolor. This is by John Singer Sargent, Mountain Stream, 1912 to 14. And it just shows you, like, his style, I'll describe, is pretty loose. As you look at this, you can see it almost feels like it's scribbly in places, or textury or rough. It doesn't have real crisp edges everywhere. I would call that kind of a loose style. Back in here, look at this texture back here. See how it's just real kind of, looks like he almost took his brush and went dab, brush, splash of color here, kind of the effect. And that's a perfectly great way to paint. I mean, you probably would look at this and say, well, it's really good. It's got a lot of color. I see where the light's coming from. I can hear the water rushing over. I can feel how cold it is. All of those things. But, so it's perfectly beautiful painting, but yet his style is pretty loose, and that works with watercolor. Now, just thinking about this painting, though, look at it for a second. Anywhere where you see white, like here, where the waves are crashing and you're getting some little white water, or on these rocks where the light's hitting it directly, where it's very white, those are areas where the artist has chosen to put no color. That will be the white of the paper. So with watercolor, you don't have white paint. You have white paper. And so you purposely will leave those areas where you know you need to have white. You have to plan ahead a little bit. You don't paint those areas. And so usually artists with watercolor will work from light to dark. So they'll start not with this dark brownish color here first, or this deep blue first. They would start with what we call washes. And a wash is a puddle of watercolor that is heavy on the water and light on the pigment. And that way it's very light. So you might go through and paint, just see this really light wash right here of purpley gray. Maybe that was the first layer that he painted down on the water parts. And maybe this really pale light green was the first color he painted down back in this part. The really light areas. And then you slowly work in your shadows and darker colors as you go, thinking and planning ahead. Because you don't want to paint, you can't go back. You can't really add the lightness later. You have to save the lightness of the colors. And I'm going to click back to this slide because I didn't say what gouache is. I really only talked about watercolor so far, but gouache is watercolor that has an inert white pigment added. So it's going to have, so this is kind of like breaking the rules of watercolor, where you have to keep your white on your painting, keep the white of the paper. With gouache, you do have a white pigment, a white watercolor pigment that you can use. Gouache looks a little different, though. It's not totally the same as watercolor. And the big thing is, it's not as transparent. So here's an example of gouache. And you wouldn't know just looking at it what you're looking at. You might not really recognize the difference. But if you look right here where this is white, there is white gouache paint that you can paint on. And so that's kind of the difference there. This one, the white of the bright places would have been just had to left behind, or to plan that ahead to leave that as white from the beginning. So that's kind of the big difference. A little more transparent versus opaque in using the paint. That's gouache. Our next paint material is called acrylic painting. Acrylic is very popular today. A lot of people enjoy using it. It is something that people like sometimes to get the effects of oil painting without the fumes and without having to use a solvent like turpentine or something to clean up your brushes. So people oftentimes like acrylic paint. It's also cheap. You can get it pretty reasonable in price. It is synthetic though. So the vehicle is an acrylic resin. It is not a natural material. Like linseed oil is a natural material. Acrylic resin has to be manufactured. It is synthetic. And when it dries, when acrylic dries, it forms a tough, flexible, and waterproof film. You cannot dissolve it, okay? Once it has dried, you can add water to it all day long, but it's going to stay like plastic, basically. It dries very plasticky. Oil paint, even though it's dry, you can't ever, if it's dry, you can't like rework it into a good paint again, but you could use solvent on it and actually dissolve it eventually. You can dissolve it a little bit. Where acrylic is just more like, once it's dry, it's permanent. It dries very quickly. So see the big difference there between acrylic and oil? They are probably the most similar in application as far as like what it looks like and how you paint with it. And even skilled people can't always tell the difference between acrylic and oil paint. But that's one of the biggest differences is acrylic dries very fast, oil paint dries very slow, and so the way you paint with these two types of paint is completely different. It's just a whole different way of thinking about painting. By the 1950s, this synthetic paint challenged oil painting as the main medium. Oil painting for hundreds of years have been the main type of paint. It was the highly esteemed fine art paint. And when this new paint came on in the 1950s, which wasn't all that long ago, it challenged that. Like I said, because easier to clean up. You can just wash your brushes if you don't let it dry. You cannot let your paint dry on your brushes or they're ruined. But if you don't let it dry and you clean them up in time, they're very easy to wash out with soap and water. It washes off your hands with soap and water. It does stain your clothes. They both stain your clothes if you get them on your clothes. Actually, on a smooth surface table, you can get the acrylic to wash off. It eventually kind of flakes off. Like I said, it's cheap too. So it's easier to use, it's cheaper. But oil paint is still regarded as historically kind of the true, like the authentic type of painting. Though acrylic is also recognized now as a fine art and high quality type of paint. So here's our example of acrylic painting. There are so many techniques and styles that you can take advantage of with acrylic painting. It allows for a whole world of experimentation. And in this particular one, you can see they have some very nice flat colors, playing around with value here on this flower, the detail of the outline here. But then you have this real painterly kind of blurry thing going on with the background and sort of more of a wash back here, almost like going from light to dark. So there's just a lot of, this shows many of the techniques, and not the techniques, but a few techniques that you can use with acrylic that's really kind of not really as possible with oil paint. And let me tell you one reason why. If this was painted white in the background, like it is in this picture, and then with oil, if this was oil paint, you could come back the next day and try to paint this nice pure black on top of that white, and you're probably going to get that white to mix in with it, and you're not going to get a nice, flat, solid black. It's going to get kind of gray and swirly. Or even here, where you're painting this black on top of the pink, it would be very difficult to get that to come out really nice and sharp and black and dark like that just the next day. Now, if you waited long enough with oil paint, it would dry, and you could do this layering technique like you're seeing here. But this has lots of layers going on, and this artist would have definitely benefited from using acrylic because, like I said, it dries so fast. You can paint one layer and let that dry, come back and paint the next layer and let that dry. Now, I don't know, this person may have painted this as a shape and then painted the blue as a shape, and they're not on top of each other. They're just touching by that contour edge right there. I don't know how they painted it, but just saying, you can't do that very well with oil paint. It's going to want, especially if the paint starts to get very thick, it's going to want to bleed and run and kind of keep working back into what you're doing, and you're not going to get those nice sharp edges. And, well, you get sharp edges, but it's going to, the old paint from previous underneath is going to want to work into the new paint on top. So then our final couple slides are painting and beyond. Not all artists paint using a traditional easel. Modern artists may use the wall, floor, or other surfaces as their painting surface. So, yes, traditionally it's to paint on a canvas, on an easel, which is, what is an easel? It's a portable stand used to prop a painting vertically so the artist can face his or her work in progress. Just kind of holds the painting up, straight up for you. And they're not always portable. An easel can be very big and heavy duty and you wouldn't want to haul it around. It just stays in one place and you come to it to work. But yeah, easels are very important for artists because it's not the best method to paint with your paper or canvas flat down on a tabletop because that distorts how you're seeing it. You want to have it straight up in your face so you can see a straight on view of your painting as you go, and that's the best way to work on it. So easels are important. But what this is saying is modern artists may paint on all kinds of things, and I've already talked about that stuff, about painting on walls and painting on graffiti on walls and sidewalks, and not just graffiti, but wall art where they've painted like, I think I showed you an image of like a 3D image where they create chalk art on the ground in cities, and it looks very believable, like Trompe l'oeil, where it looks like you could step into it, or there's just lots of different surfaces that people use, and basically in the modern art world, anything goes. If you want to paint on it, it's permissible, and not always legal, but it's permissible, and it's kind of like experiment. See how far you can push things to still be called art. What limits can you go to or not go to and still call it art? And so this isn't a super modern example right here. This is painting on the floor from 1969. So that's pretty old now, but this is still considered in the modern era. Really anything past 1940 is still considered contemporary art. Now there's the most contemporary art, which we probably now kind of chunk into the 2000s and beyond. But contemporary art, really the modern era, the postmodern era, really 1940s and on. So anyway, this person, as you can see, has taken the floor and she is just dumping buckets of paint on the floor. And she's just working her way across the floor, and before the whole thing will be covered eventually, and then she's going to let that dry. And that's definitely a different way of painting, isn't it? A different technique than the traditional paint and brush and oil paint and all the technique that historically was considered painting. And I wanted to show you just a couple other kind of out-of-the-box types of, quote, painting you can think of. Now, these are not using a paint and brush, not even technically using pigments and binder and all that like we've discussed. So these are definitely outside the box. But this is called a mosaic. And mosaics are made of small tiles, rocks, stones, something that is colored and arranged in a certain way. They're close together, so you don't really see the space between them very much. You mostly just see the color. Though you can tell, if you look at this image, you can see the little squares, the little pieces that have been made. Closely spaced particles, and these are called tesserae. These little squares or these little pieces of, oftentimes, it's a ceramic glazed clay that's been made into these little tiles. You can do mosaics by taking some colored glass or colored ceramic ware, and that's even broken into pieces, and then you just arrange it in a certain way to get the color effects in the areas that you want. So you might draw the thing out and then you fill it with the colored tiles. But as you can see in this one, they're doing it in a painterly way, right? There are shadows and highlights and very detailed work of the contours of Jesus's face in this picture, and the shadows and highlights and the form and the three-dimensional quality of his robe that we see around his shoulders. And look at his neck and the musculature that's shown through using the placement of these tiles based on color. So it's not like they're painting the white on top of that to get the highlight. It's the tiles are white, and then they are actually, the way they're put together is they are basically grouted like a tile floor or backsplash would be. It's the same idea. They're set in space in the area with some sort of glue or even like a sticky cement surface, and then they're grouted over basically. And this type of artwork was really, we see that in the islands of like Crete, off the coast of Greece, is where we see a lot of early mosaic work of wealthy people, wealthy fancy homes in those islands in Greece, the country of Greece, Greek style mosaic work. And then also in the Roman Empire, a lot of that became a very popular form of art, was mosaic tile work. And then this particular one is a Christian image that during the Byzantine Empire and time period of art, early Christians were making art images, and they were using Roman style, some of that stuff that had been kind of passed around from the Mediterranean islands to Greece to then Rome, and then they were using that same style to create Christian images for the Byzantine time period. So this is what that's actually from, and we'll study that more later as well. But the kind of funny thing is just to seeing how they're using this hard material, piecing it together like a puzzle to create the effect almost of painting. And if you step back, the colors blend and mix together. And that makes me think of pointillism, like the Georges Seurat that we looked at earlier, and how he used visual color mixing by using just dots and pointillism when we talked about color. And then the last sort of out-of-the-box type of painting is tapestry. So surprisingly, shockingly, this very elaborate scene that we're looking at here is actually a tapestry. So what that means is it's weaving fabric or yarns and colored strings together in a way that creates an image. And so this became a very popular technique through many cultures and many civilizations to create these textiles as either rugs or garments or things that hang on the wall. And so this one is showing a scene. The Battle of, its title I don't have, which is fine, but it's showing a scene that's called the Battle of Granicus. It was designed for the French King Louis XIV, And it shows, it just really, really shows how painting and tapestry became intertwined. Like it's just really showing, it began as a painting, it says, and actually created it into, reproduced it as tapestries. So that's pretty interesting that that's seen. So the skill and talent of weaving together string into a pattern that would work into a tapestry is pretty amazing. No paint has been painted on it. It's done through weaving. So anyway, that is another out-of-the-box type of quote-unquote painting that we can look at. So it's not that you have to master or know all of these types of painting. It's really, let me go back to the initial first slide. It's really just understanding that there are many ways that artists choose to work and paint, and that they choose those on purpose, intentionally, to get the effects and the type of look that they want to help them express themselves or their style. Or in some cases, like when we talked about the Italian Renaissance, because that's was just what was done at that time. That was the standard for painting, was fresco. Or that's what people were wanting. That's what was popular and what was being paid for. So there's just lots of reasons why, and many types of painting that there have been through the ages. So that's the end of chapter 7. We have now covered 2 media. We've covered drawing and painting, and chapter 8 will be printmaking.